All right, so we just finished the unit called the Political Crisis of the 1850s. Now remember, they don't call it that at this time period. Historians have named these time periods. Looking back, like I was saying earlier, for those who go through a civil war, never know they're even in a civil war. For example, the Civil War that's coming up that we're going to address, the American Civil War, was not called a Civil War until 1907 by Congress. That's how long it took for them to decide it was a Civil War. They typically referred to as the rebellion in the South. They didn't see it as a Civil War, just a rebellion. Okay, so this time period that we're moving into, historians can use hindsight as 2020 and look back and say, this is the time period that they start succeeding, that the states start separating from the Union. Okay, remember Lincoln's adage, the house divided by itself cannot stand. The house divides now. Okay, that's what's going to happen during this unit. The 1860 election, the most contentious election in American history. Some might argue the Al Gore, George Bush election took its place. I doubt it, because we didn't have a civil war over it. States didn't separate over it. We have four major candidates trying to get the presidency in this election. We have Republicans, the first time we have a Republican candidate, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and the Constitutional Union. Who do you think is representing the Republicans? Okay, so with those notes, okay, not everything on those slides are it's going to be what you're required to have, okay? So for this, when I'm talking about this slide, you add more to it here. When I talk about this slide, you add more here, okay? For example, is there a name of a person for Republican? Nope, but I'm going to give it to you. Abraham Lincoln is the candidate for the Republicans. Stephen Douglas is the Northern Democrat. He beat Abraham Lincoln for the congressional seat. Southern Democrat is John Breckinridge. You'll get the name spellings in the coming slides. And the Constitutional Union nominates John Bell. All right, so President Buchanan sees the handwriting on the wall because the South is threatening to secede. He says, it's illegal, but there's nothing I can do to stop it. The president has no power to stop it. He doesn't think it's right. He doesn't think it's legal, but hey, if they're going to do it, there's nothing I can do to stop him. Remember, he's the president in 1859, right before the 1860 election, right before Lincoln takes over. We're going to take a look at the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession and their Declaration of Immediate Causes, which is very much like the Declaration of Independence. You don't have to write the next slide down. Actually, is it the next slide? No, I must have taken that slide out. I apologize. In these documents, though, they do state why they're succeeding, which really sounds a lot like the Declaration of Independence. They believe the federal government has become destructive to their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. I'm being very simplistic here. It's much more complicated than that. Remember, the issue here is over taxes. They are taxing with tariffs on finished goods coming into the South to a point where they cannot afford it. They don't make products in the South. They produce raw material, send it to the North. The North produces it into a finished product and then sends it back to them. Moreover, when they tried to avoid those tariffs and buy imports, the federal government established forts on the outer edges of the southern states so that shipping had to come and stop by the federal fort, pay their tariff, which in turn would raise the cost of the finished goods. So no matter what, the Southerners were stuck paying a tariff on these finished products. So just a reminder, the Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas, he favors popular sovereignty. He's very unpopular in the South, though. Remember, Southern states typically are Democrats. Well, they all are Democrats. This Northern Democrat, however, is in favor of popular sovereignty, which makes him unpopular in the South. When he is nominated, the Southern Democrats break away, and they go have a separate convention where they nominate John Breckinridge. So this group splinters, the Democrats splinter into a Northern faction and a Southern faction. The Northern ends up staying with this particular candidate. The Southern Democrats nominate John Breckinridge. Breckinridge carries most of the Southern states. Now, these two Democrats split the Democratic vote, which allows for the Republican to win the presidency. He's a senator, so when he doesn't make president, he keeps his Senate seat. He goes back to the Senate and he urges compromise. He pushes for a compromise in order to save the Union. But once war breaks out, he leaves and moves to the South. He joins the Confederates when war breaks out. But until then, he urged for compromise. Find some way to keep from going to war. The Constitutional Union Party, we also have a split among the Republicans. So we have a group from the Whigs and the Know-Nothings. They end up splitting and joining together, creating the Constitutional Union. They nominate John Bell. And of course, Old Abe is the Republican candidate. He's seen as a compromised candidate, not a compromised, but a compromised candidate. Not too far right, he's considered a moderate. Now, the Republican Convention in 1860 is the first time they convene as a new party. This is the same Republican Party we have today. When was the Democrat Party started? Under what individual? Andrew Jackson. When? 1830. Test questions, test questions. Might want to mark that on your paper, test question. Now you got the birth of the two modern parties we have today, the two dominant parties we have today. 1830. So here's a quote from a history professor from Columbia University. It says, the Republican Convention of 1860 was, quote, unlike any thus far known in national history. It was greater in size, in enthusiasm, in noise, in wire pulling, in self-righteousness, in lust for office, and in its blend of mass hysteria and idealistic fervor. Alan Nevins. Sounds pretty wild. Notice one of the words he used, lust for office. So Lincoln is seen as having few political enemies and is regarded as a conservative. This Republican Party appealed to the old Whigs in the Henry Clay mold. So not the newer generation of Whigs, but the older generation, much more conservative. So in history, you have several schools of thought. One of those is considered Whig historians versus revisionist historians. Whig historians come out of this time frame of being conservative, staying true to history, versus revisionist historians, which is predominantly what we have today. They are rewriting history to fit a social mold. So in other words, the documentary that I have, The War That Made America, we watched a little bit of it last Thursday, didn't we? That is a revisionist documentary made to make George Washington look pretty poor as a leader. Whereas the Newt Gingrich video, The Indispensable American, that is from a Whig historian perspective, someone who is conservative and keeping the legacy of an individual intact. So I read both, but it's always important for you to know what you're reading and what perspective that author is coming from. It makes a difference on what you believe or what you take away from that writing. So not everything you read is good history. Just be aware of that. I got stuff in here that is just garbage history, but I do read it so that I know what the other side is saying. Whereas, though, Whig historians can be biased, and they are biased, we all are, biased the other direction as well. But I can tell you, the revisionist historians, for the most part, are purposefully rewriting our history. When I went to, the only time I ever went to the American Association of Historians Conference up in Seattle, listened to several of these PhD candidates give their research speeches, and I was shocked at how many of them openly said they were Marxist historians. That is totally contrary to American history. And so with the stuff that they were producing was absolutely revisionist history for the purpose of detaching us the American people, from our historical roots. It's pretty scary stuff to see what's going on. So the results, we always got to know results of the elections. Lincoln won 180 electoral votes, 1.8 million popular votes. I don't like using popular votes because they're irrelevant in the presidential election. What matters is the electoral college votes. But I put it up there just kind of give you a reference here. Douglas only gets 12. But notice that 1.8 versus 1.3 million. But look at which is not a big difference. We're only talking 500,000 votes, popular votes. But it's a whole lot different when you're looking at electoral college votes. Why is what again? Say again. Buchanan? The president before Lincoln? Because he didn't do a whole lot. He's considered by some as being almost a worthless president that could have stopped the Civil War. But he argues, I had no power to do it. So, and to be honest with you, constitutionally, he's right. He's right on one hand, wrong on the other. It's not illegal, according to our Declaration of Independence. It's not illegal, nor did he have the power to stop it. But historians, mostly today, say he's terrible because he could have stopped it. But he says, I didn't have the power to do it. So that's why you don't hear much about him. That's about all he's famous for, is sitting back, watching it happen, as they would say. Oh, didn't see them there. Breckinridge gets 72, which is the Southern Democrat. Who are you looking for? Emily's here. Nope, that was last period. Second. Yeah. And John Bell received 39. I want to show you something. Douglas gets 12 electoral votes. Look at the popular vote. 1.3 million. Look at Bell, 39, but he only gets 500,000 votes. It's not about the popular vote. All right, so Lincoln, he receives most of the votes, none from the South. He is purely a sectional candidate. He's only supported in the North, which the Electoral College is supposed to prevent. It's supposed to prevent a one-sided or one regional candidate. All the other elections, the candidate who won had to have votes in multiple sections of the country. In this case, he was able to pull it off with just a northern section. And that's exactly what would happen with if we elected president just with popular vote. You'd only have to go to about 12 major cities in the country, and you could forget everyone else, and you'd win the election every time by going to these about 24 cities. Last week, Hillary Clinton even advocated getting rid of the Electoral College. Democrats always say that when they lose. It's amazing. They think it's the greatest thing when they win. You never hear Republicans say abolish the Electoral College when they lose. It's only Democrats. There's a reason for it. A lot like Jackson. Jackson wanted as many people to vote because there were a lot more poor people than there are, say, well-off people. And who's poor people likely to vote for? Those who promised the goodies. So we'll talk more about that in government class, those of you who are in government. All right, South Carolina. December 20th, 1860. They pass a resolution. It's called the Ordinance of Secession. They rescind the 1788 ratification of the Constitution, removing them from the Union, removing themselves from the Union. Something you got to remember here, and we didn't cover this in history at all that I can remember. The states existed before the Constitution. It is the states that created the federal government. There is a huge debate that went on. The Constitution was not fully ratified for something like 9 or 10 years. Because you had those who were worried about the federal government getting too strong. They are called the Anti-Federalists, or Jeffersonians, They're also called Republicans. Remember all those terms? They're all the same thing. Not Republican Party. Jackson was a Republican, by the way, was a Jeffersonian. Then you had the Federalists who wanted a strong federal government. John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington. The states agreed to the Constitution to advocate or to give some of their own power to the federal government under certain conditions. And one of those conditions were they had to have a Bill of Rights. That's the reason we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, to protect the states from the federal government, the states and the people. When the federal government agreed to that, when Congress agreed to that, the other states signed on. Now keep in mind, here's something you need to understand, and it's critically important as it is yesterday, as it is today and tomorrow. The states have all the power. They recognize there are some things they don't do very well because of the Articles of Confederation exposed that. So they agreed to take part of their sovereignty and delegate it to a central government. For example, if Dr. Neville, during my internship, tells me, Mr. Moffat, I normally do this as part of my job. I evaluate Mr. Hale. But I'm delegating that job to you for me because I don't have time. You have time, you can go do it. I had the authority to do that, to give an evaluation of Mr. Hale, the principal. But at any time, Dr. Neville can take it back. Why? Why can he take that authority back from me? Think. I mean, really, it's almost not even a trick question, but it might even feel that way. But let me rephrase it this way. How many of you got siblings at home? Okay. Mariah, your mom and dad wants to go on a hot date. They want to go see a show and just get ready from the kids. They delegate their parental authority to supervise your sibling. Do you have younger ones? Brother, sister? Sister. They're responsible for your sister, not you. But they want to go somewhere. So they say, Mariah, please take care of your sister for us. That is delegation of their sole responsibility for that welfare of your sister to you. You have their authority to do what you got to do to keep your sister safe. When they come home after enjoying a nice evening, they take it back from you, right? Why? Over you?
Well, over the job.
Rephrase it again. I think you're on the right track here.
They have the authority to take care of her instead of them having to.
Yes, it is and always was the parent's responsibility for her sister. They have the authority to delegate it to someone, but they can take it back anytime they want. So, for example, I allow you to sit in whatever seat you want. I give you the authority to choose your seat you want. But at any moment, I can take that authority back and delegate a seat to you. Because the authority always was mine. Okay, same principle. The states exist before the Constitution. They enumerate it. You're going to find this out, mostly government will, but they establish some of the, they delegated their authority to the federal government to do a certain job. And they warned, if you don't do this the way we expect you to, that's why we want the Bill of Rights, and then we always reserve the right to take back what we have given, which is defended by the Declaration of Independence. This is something the Southern people have held on to from the very beginning. They always believed they had the sovereign right to leave the Union should they ever feel like they're being abused. In fact, more often the northern states threatened to leave the Union before this time period under the same principle. They are the creator of the federal government. Is another way to think of it. If a potter, a person who makes pots, does not a potter have the right to decide what use a vessel is? I want this pot to be used for water. I want this pot to be used for wine. I want this pot to be a honey bucket. I want this pot to be... I don't even like this one. I'm going to break it, throw it away. Does the pot have any right to tell the potter what it can and cannot do? Absolutely not. Does the federal government, therefore, let me back up. Therefore, you have the states who is the creator of the federal government. Would the states ever see it in their best interest to forego all of their authority to say, you know what, this is not working out anymore? Why would they? After all, they got the Declaration that would be totally contrary to that ideal. Now, I'm setting this up for you to understand the Southern perspective. You don't get this in your textbooks. You get one thing. Lincoln freed the slaves. The war was about slavery. Slavery was a big deal, don't get me wrong. But it's not just about that. But I'm trying to set you up to understand how historians have it wrong about Buchanan. Buchanan is right and wrong at the same time. He's wrong that it's not, he says it's illegal to separate. It's not illegal. Secondly, he's right. He can't do anything about it to stop him. Lincoln disagrees. All right. So, remember, rescinding. They agreed. They passed they ratified the Constitution in 1788. They are now taking it back. As the creator of the federal government, they're taking back their vote, which by doing so removes them from the Union. All right. It's important that you understand this. This sets the rest of the stage. You're going to see this in the movies that we watch. You're going to see this argument made today over the legalization of marijuana. You're going to see this argument made over gay marriage. You're going to see this argument made over a lot of state right issues that's going on in our country that you are going to have to deal with. This is the arguments that are being made. Oh yeah, here I do have it in here. So here's you do not have to write it. This is what they wrote in their secession. The state of South Carolina at a convention of the people of the state of South Carolina, begun and holden at Columbia on the 17th day of December in the year of our Lord, 1860, and thence continued to adjournment by to Charleston, and thereby divers adjournment into the 20th day of December of the same year. In other words, they're telling, this is the time period that we met. An ordinance to dissolve the union between the state of South Carolina and the states, notice capital, and other states, notice capital S, united with her under the compact. Should be a key word for you. Entitled the Constitution of the United States. They see the Constitution as a compact, as an agreement. Those are in government, that should mean something to you. The Constitution was an agreement. And what they're going to say is they have broken this agreement. They, the northern states in particular, the federal government. We, the people of the South Carolina, in convention assembled do declare and ordain, and it is hereby declared and ordained that the ordinance adopted by us in convention on the 23rd day of May in the year of our Lord, 17,788, whereby the Constitution of the United States of America was ratified, and also all acts and parts of the acts of the General Assembly of this state ratifying amendment of the said Constitution are hereby repealed, and the union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states, capital, under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved. This is a critical component right here. Okay? The southern states still see the Constitution as a compact, as an agreement. That winter is called Secession winter. Again, remember this is what historians do. They name time periods. It's referred to as Secession winter. 7 different states secede from the Union during this winter period. And they form the Confederate States of America. I'm going to ask you probably what happened during the Secession winter. The answer is 7 states seceded from the Union and formed a new government, or formed the Confederate States of America. Now, as you write this, think about a couple questions here. We can have a quick discussion. Did war have to happen? Could have it been prevented? Perhaps most importantly, what was Abraham Lincoln's role in the commencement of hostilities? And could have he stopped the war? Your answers are going to come up here. The what if in history, I never like to play too much. There's too many variables. But it is something we ought to think about from time to time. Secession winter. So after South Carolina, others followed. So they all wrote their own order of succession and their own verbiage. All right, so we have 13 congressmen who tried to come up with a compromise to save the Union. Forgive me, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. Credidin Compromise. We're not going to go into the details of it. Just understand there was 2 different compromises offered. The first one was outright rejected. The second was ineffective. In other words, they agreed to it, but it didn't have any teeth. It didn't do anything. So, the nice thing about going through archives and records, historians can find stuff that wasn't previously made aware of. And one of those, they have found writings from Lincoln and from congressmen, Republican congressmen and representatives to Lincoln and to each other. And it's indicated that Lincoln had encouraged Republicans not to compromise, not to find a way, not to work with them, reject all offers. So some historians would argue that Republicans consistently chose party over union, Here's the thing. Had the compromise been adopted, secession certainly would have been averted in the southern states. Now, it is not going to affect the South Carolinian secession. They've already succeeded. Not succeeded, ceded. They have already left the Union. But the others could have been saved. Some historians argue that the slavery issue in the territories would have been settled. After all, the Supreme Court has already made a decision on that. And Lincoln would have been a one-term president. Because remember, the Republican Party's main issue was slavery. Slavery and taxes. They wanted to keep the tariffs in place, but outlaw slavery. Now, how would you outlaw slavery? If you're a lawmaker, how would you outlaw slavery? In a constitutional republic.
Make it another part of the Constitution.
Say again?
Make it another part of the Constitution.
So what would we call that?
Either some sort of bill or an act.
An amendment.
Oh, yeah.
Acts and bills is not constitutional, but amendments to the Constitution is. So acts and bills are makes federal law. But the higher law is the Constitution. So in a which, by the way, when you speak of constitutional republic, it does scratch your head. How in the world do you have slavery? Especially when it's built on the premise of the Declaration of Independence. That's a whole different issue that comes into philosophy and stuff like that. That it's really hard, and of course in the context of the times. But in a constitutional republic, if you're going to make a system-wide change to a law, then it's through an amendment to the Constitution. So my question is, if that's what it would take to free the slaves, why, and if the North has the votes, why didn't they just choose to amend the Constitution?
Because it leads to a war.
But they're going to a war anyway, it looks like. They're going to succeed anyway.
Then we make the war longer.
But there's no guarantee we're at a war. They're just leaving the Union. See, remember, the South did not take up arms to leave the Union. They just walked away, be like you walking out of my class. As opposed to you come up here fighting me, leaving me on the floor bleeding, and then you walk out the door. Do you see the difference? The South just walked out the door. They didn't fight. Who brought arms into it? The North did. Now, some would argue South Carolina when they fired on Fort Sumter, which we'll talk about. But who invaded the South? Lincoln did, 75,000 troops, which we'll get to here pretty soon. Okay, so why not, again, because wars don't change the Constitution. The only thing that changes the Constitution is the amendment process. Why not start the amendment process? That is some of the questions that historians still ask today. See, up the last 100 or 30 years, Lincoln has been deified. He is on this pedestal that it'd be totally, how dare you talk negative about Lincoln. But historians are starting to come around and say, wait a minute, let's take another look at this guy. Why is he so deified again? And you're going to see how he's violated the Constitution in multiple areas. But the question comes down to, if you want to free the slaves and you've got the votes and the North controls the votes in Congress, why not ratify the Constitution or amend the Constitution? Why don't they? No answers? No guess? They have the votes. The North, they supposedly have the votes. The North controls Congress. Why do they not? And then when these states leave the Union, there is no votes, supposedly, that would vote for slavery. Why don't they amend the Constitution while they're out of the Union? They weren't thinking. Oh, they're thinking. But I understand your point of view. Maybe they weren't thinking.
If the South leaves, then they're not part of the United States, right?
Right. That's the Southern's perspective.
If you amend the Constitution, it won't work for the North, because the South isn't there.
True, from that perspective, if you go from the Southern perspective, you're mixing two views, but yes, from that viewpoint, if they're not even, let me back up. From the Northern perspective, they see open seats in Congress. The North already has the power. They have, the Southern congressmen are not in office. They have left. So they have nothing but Northerners there. They have all the votes they need to make whatever law they want. Why don't they? They didn't have the chance. They had 4 years of Civil War. They had months before guns started shooting. This is a question that still puzzles historians. Some historians come to the conclusion they never wanted to free the slaves in the first place. They wanted to run control over the southern states for the economic purposes. I can't deny that fact because they had all of the votes. They could have did it. In fact, when did the slaves become free?
After the Civil War?
Yes, with the 13th Amendment. After the war, after 650,000 is dead, now Congress amends the Constitution. Wait a minute. If that's all it took, why didn't you do that before? There wasn't, but they didn't have to have a war. They could have did it before the war. It still leaves people scratching their heads. We can only speculate. There is some written documentation that would suggest they wanted this war for nefarious purposes. They had no idea it was going to get out of hand the way it did. Here's the other thing. The northern states, they all could have freed slaves in their own states, and not all of them did at that point. So what do you think about that? They're arguing to the South they shouldn't have slaves, but they themselves, some of them still have slavery. Uh-huh. So,
You want to make the South look bad.
yeah, there's some argue that point, AJ. Some people argue that point. So, I don't know that we're ever going to human nature isn't straight up and down, so we're never going to get a straight answer on that. But it's something as human beings we ought to think about. Why didn't they just go for an amendment? You're going to see in the movie why, by the way. One of the reasons why. Because the Northerners didn't want to free him either, ladies and gentlemen. And the movie Lincoln is a great example of what they thought about that ideal. The North is not all that high and mighty like they want you to think. All right. Mississippi succeeds, followed by Florida. You just see them falling like dominoes. Several of them in January. They start falling like dominoes. Remember, Lincoln has not yet, I'm trying to think, has he been sworn in yet? That's January. No, he's not sworn in yet. So all of these states are succeeding before Lincoln is sworn in. He's been elected, but he's not been sworn in yet. And Buchanan says, I don't think you can do this legally, but I have no power to stop you. Let's talk real quick about the Confederate States of America. Formed in February of 1861. They select Jefferson Davis as the president, Alexander Stephens as vice president, and his cabinet, these two and the cabinet are considered moderates. The real radical Southerners, they had this nickname called fire eaters. Back then they weren't, I guess, all that original. But their real radicals, they did not allow it to be involved in their government. Contrary to what history would tell us, your history books would tell us that these guys were radical Southerners. In fact, they were not. Remember the Declaration of Independence. It says when the government's purpose is to ensure the natural rights of the people. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When the government ceases or becomes destructive to these natural rights, it is the obligation of the people to alter or abolish the form of government and create a new one to which they think will give them the best opportunity for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the formula, the framework the Southern states are following. So the Confederate Constitution removes or reforms the ambiguous and contentious sections of the United States. So they form their own constitution, and the areas that was either confrontational or even vague, they change it. So it's very clear on what is being said. They take their approach of the anti-federalists, making a strong state government and a weaker federal government. The things the anti-federalist was worried about came true with the federal government. They are now placing in the Constitution the provisions that the anti-federalists 100 years earlier wanted in there in the first place, with the hopes that it will prevent another problem. So let's take a look at the nature of the Constitution. State sovereignty is the backbone of their Constitution, or the nature of their union. Back to the principles of Articles of Confederation. So the nature of union is state sovereignty. The nature of economics, they outlawed or made it illegal by law the Hamiltonian economic system, which is what the United States was on, and what Andrew Jackson fought against, won for a while, and now we're back on it. They want to go back to the hard currency. Or if you're going to use paper money, it needs to be backed by hard currency. They established the executive and judicial branches. The executive serves 1 6-year term. They did authorize a federal court system, though it was never established. State courts handled all the cases. They were real reluctant about a federal court. They seen what happened earlier with the Supreme Court, Mulberry versus Madison in 1803, and some other court cases. So they just soon let the courts be handled by the states. Interesting is they did keep the necessary and proper and supremacy clause in place. That's very surprising to me and to a lot of historians, because it's been one of the most misused, abused, and destructive clauses in our own Constitution. And the necessary and proper and supremacy clause is what really empowered the northern politicians to run roughshod over the South. But they kept that in. And I left there with why. Not really sure why. I haven't been able to find an answer to that. So let's talk about slavery. Now they make mention of slavery in the Constitution, and it's written in a way that looks like it's very deliberately set up that they were fighting over slavery. There's some discrepancy with that, but I think most people would argue that the Constitution of the Confederate States expressed the purpose of separating was over slavery. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but I think that's the majority take. But it did, I think the thing to remember is it did protect slavery, but it did not prohibit the states from abolishing slavery either. A lot like popular sovereignty. They allowed the states to decide whether they're going to remain slave or free. So that's not a complete protection, is it? March 1861, Lincoln is inaugurated. And the question everybody was waiting for, they were holding their breath, what will Lincoln do? He answers that in his inaugural address. He emphasized multiple times, we will enforce the laws. That's a huge departure from Buchanan. The question is, how is he going to enforce the laws? Buchanan agreed it was illegal, which means it's against the law, but he had no way of enforcing it. Lincoln is suggesting, yes, there is. That brings us to federal forts and property. We've already talked a little bit about this. But there are federal forts and what's considered federal property. Federal forts are federal property located in these states, in these southern states. And one in particular, Fort Sumter. The state says that is in South Carolina. That land is our land. Federal government, get out. We no longer recognize the United States as having any authority over us. You pack up and leave. President Lincoln has his spark. So, just give you an idea of how crazy things were at this time. Lincoln had to sneak into Washington, D.C. just for his inauguration, hid out of threat of being assassinated. He's actually the first president to have Secret Service detail. The commanding officer at Fort Sumter refuses to give up the fort. At the same time, we have Confederate commissioners going to Washington, D.C. with the authority to offer to purchase the fort. Here you have Southerners who's coming to D.C. to say, we don't want a war, we don't want you out here. We recognize that this is, we're taking the upper road and recognizing, quote, recognizing this is federal land. We want to buy it from you. Does that sound like a group of people wanting war? Who? Who wants war, Aaron? The Confederates? They want to buy it. The commissioners are left hanging, waiting. By the orders of President Lincoln and Secretary of State Seward. Because they've got a plan of their own they're working. So on March 15th, Lincoln gets his cabinet together and says, hey, why don't we provision the fort? Send a bunch of supplies down there. The cabinet knew by doing this, this would start the war. They're sending, probably via Navy, around, this is the plan anyway, to bring in food and water and supplies. Because South Carolina is probably going to do a blockade against them, going to try to starve them out. But by the presence of sending more troops down, that's going to aggravate the situation. So on the 29th, they agree to send an expedition. Remember, this whole time period, the commissioners are waiting to see these guys so they can offer a cash deal for the property. April 12th, 1861. Fort Sumter is fired upon by South Carolina forces. The cannon barrage begins. That's the official start of the Civil War. April 12th, 1861. Fort Sumter is fired upon by South Carolinians. Test question, by the way. That date. Which, by the way, this is a perfect multiple choice question. Did we have to go to war? Well, General Winfield Scott suggested a provision was not necessary. He had what's called an anaconda plan. What does an anaconda do? What is it, first of all?
Giant ass snake.
Yeah, that's right. A big constrictor snake. One that would use you for dinner.
Almost the size of like a rain tree.
Yes, big. They constrict, they wrap around their prey and kill them by suffocation, by making where they can't breathe. They squeeze them so hard, you know, somebody squeezes you a big old bear hug, you're gasping for air. He says, we can just wrap around South Carolina along the shoreline and cut them off. Just wait them out. Nah, that's not what he wanted to do. Lincoln clearly understood what would happen. If he orders a relief expedition, the South will do one or two things. They're either going to let this fort be provisioned, which in turn would make them look weak, or they're going to fire on the fleet or the fort, which will be the spark of the war. If they do that, then Lincoln can say, see, it wasn't me that started the war. The ones who fired the first shot was those rebels. And of course, we know now what he's done. He in fact does set the stage for the South Carolinians to fire the first shot, and they have ever since been blamed for starting the war. Those are the only two options the South had right there. They either let them be reprovisioned and they look like what their words were meant nothing, they're weak, or they could stand their ground, not allow the relief expedition to get there, and then by doing so, they will spark the war and have the blame for it. All right, so something you need to be aware of. There's a handwritten note from Lincoln to the governor of South Carolina telling him the fort will be supplied. Therefore, we know Lincoln knew the outcome of this action. He also knows the South is going to respond in the way they did, and they were ready for it because he wrote the note to the governor. Hey, we're coming, and we're going to supply our fort. South Carolina's already said, don't do it. Don't do it. We're waiting for an answer. We want to buy the land. No answer comes. They never address them. Opportunity after opportunity after opportunity they ignored. April 15th, 1861, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion in the South for the purpose of, quote, saving the Union. You're going to hear some of these things come up in the movie we're going to watch. Lincoln calls up 75,000 federal troops for the purpose of going down south and put down the rebellion. He does not recognize the Confederate States as a separate country, and he does not recognize the states as having sovereign borders and sovereign governments. This is very important here. Virginia succeeds on the 17th, 2 days after he calls up these troops. Notice my second note, though. They voted against secession earlier that month. What made the difference when they came back and voted for it was the fact that he was calling up troops to invade a fellow country. That was, you're going to see this in the movie, where the Virginians are so outraged that not only is he calling up troops to invade a fellow country, But he's actually going to march through their country to do it. And that is such an egregious front to these people that they are willing to go to war now over it. The movie we're going to watch does a terrific job at showing the Southern perspective. And that's the reason we're going to watch it, because you don't really get it anywhere else in modern society. This is such an insult to have federal troops walk through your land unopposed to go after your neighbor. They're not going to tolerate it. Well, Virginia, being a powerful state that they are, the other southern, so you got the upper south goes along the northern border, what's considered the Mason-Dixon line, that's when they decide to go as well. If Virginia's going to go, we're going and joining them. So you get the rest of the southern states succeed after Virginia. Hang tight, we got 9 minutes. We're going to finish this. At this point, there is no going back. There's no going back at this point. This would be considered stage 4 out of 5 stages. This would be the end of stage 4 of the 5 stages that leads to civil war, according to Dr. I can't think of his name. He's from Johns Hopkins University. The 5th is kinetic action. That's where we're at now. When you start exchanging gunfire, that's the 5th and final stage. So there's no going back at this point. We are loaded for bear, and the war begins tomorrow. Okay? So review your notes. I'm surprised we got through all 30 slides today. I did not anticipate that. So please understand, this is very simplistic. Because we are so short in this class, we can't go into the details. More books have been written over this time period in American history than any other period. It's a very, very complicated issue. Okay? I am clearly not doing it justice, but for our purposes, it's going to be as good as we're going to get. So the lines have been drawn. People are in the batting cage. We're ready to rock and roll tomorrow, and the bullets start flying.